Yeah, we're gonna attend Miriam Namazi's
Oh, good.
at 12:30 when she has a keynote speech.
Right, 12:30.
Why don't you speak to me though?
What do you have to say?
Why do you hate Muslims so much, man?
I don't hate Muslims. I hate Islam
Why do you hate Islam?
because it's stupid.
Why is it stupid? Is it stupid?
It's really stupid.
I think we have a lot of good reasons to believe the intellectual foundation of Islam is very, very strong.
No, they're not.
Okay, why? Why are they not?
It relies on this prophet of yours.
Okay, what's wrong with our prophet?
How does he know?
How does he
Where's
know?
where's
Did
the
he
evidence?
even exist? Okay,
And you know,
let me give you some evidence. Shall
I
give you
read
some
this
evidence?
book last night.
How do you find it?
Terrible.
Okay.
This is disgraceful.
Give me some
You
contentions.
clearly have some money here because you can put up these nicely printed booklets. But this,
You have money. You have a very nice suit on.
well, yeah. So what I'm saying is
Sure.
you've got some money. You're investing money in this, and then you've got this crap. This is rehashed creationist nonsense. This is the same stuff we've been dealing with in the United States for the last 50 years.
Okay.
And there's absolutely nothing in here that's original.
Okay.
And all of it's been frequently refuted. So,
But what we just made are statements and generalizations. You haven't given any substance here. What do you mean? I mean, do you disagree that, for example, when we talk
for
about...
instance, well, you make the first cause argument.
No, we don't actually. It's actually called the Kalam cosmological argument. It's a rehashed version. It's a modern version that has
Yes.
good premises and if
No,
you study logic...
no, there's no.
Okay,
come on, no.
okay. Let me give it to you in summary, right?
Okay, give me the summary.
There's two premises here. Whatever begins to exist is a cause. The second premise is the universe began to exist, okay? And we could substantiate that philosophically and using astrophysics. Then the conclusion,
can't.
which makes it a sound and valid argument, is that then the universe has a cause. So if the universe
No.
began to exist, it has a cause. So let me just repeat that.
Okay.
One, whatever
No,
begins to exist is
I
a
heard
cause.
you.
The universe
Let
began
me-
to
let me-
exist, therefore the universe has a cause.
let me point
It
out-
doesn't mean it's God though.
I will point
But we
out-
use
right.
conceptual analysis
That's
yeah.
where I will point out two things
Okay,
there.
good.
And one is that modern physics does not support your claims.
Okay.
That you can have spontaneous things just popping into existence. They do all the time.
Okay, can I address that?
And
Is that
well,
all right?
first, and let me make my other point,
Okay.
which is that, as you mentioned, pointing out that there was a cause does not imply a God.
I agree.
So why do we care?
You didn't let me finish.
Okay, now you're going to finish.
Okay,
Okay.
good. So the first thing, in terms of random quantum fluctuations and subatomic events that don't correspond to causality, well, that's a particular view amongst physicists, which is the indeterministic view. We don't have to hold that view. You know, the mathematics is there, but there could be different translations in the real world. So for instance, you could take a deterministic view, which is the David Bowie interpretation, for instance, right? And there's other physicists who are taking that view. So you can't just say it's all of physics. And I think that's a bit of a scientific outdated cliche.
But then what you're doing is you're admitting that you're basically cherry picking the.
No, we're not, because
Well, yes, you are. You just said that.
No, no. let me tell you why. Because if you take a Kantian argument that causality is a priori, it's independent from experience. Because we only know that we could order our perceptions in the universe based upon the innate concept of causality. So to accept that there's no causality in the quantum fluctuations would be denying your own very perceptions in the first place. So we have good reasons to believe that there's causality here, and quantum fluctuations don't say much. The other point I'm trying to make is when we know there's a cause for the universe, which you're happily assuming that there may be a cause, the problem is that now when you use conceptual analysis, you come to some starting conclusions. For example, we would argue that Occam's razor must be uncaused. We would argue that therefore it must be eternal. We would argue that it's immaterial and transcendent because it creates the material world. So from these perspectives, it's in line with the monotheistic view of God. I don't see that as a problem.
I see that as a huge problem.
Why?
Because what you've got is an anthropomorphic patriarchal God.
No, we haven't
yes,
said
you-
anything about
oh,
anthropomorphism.
wait,
Who
yes,
said
you
that?
have.
That's a Christian narrative.
This is the Islamic narrative too.
No, in the
You're all-
Quran,
you're all-
Quran it says
you're all
"Laysa
built-
kamithli shay," which means God is transcendent. There is nothing like unto Him. And when we say Him, is no gender.
So what?
But do you see how some of your outdated cliches
You've
you
got-
can't apply them to the
You've
Quran?
got a personal God who takes a personal interest in human beings.
Okay, what's wrong with that?
You have no evidence for this. The
We do.
universe.
Can I give you evidence for God having a will? Okay, an eternal being bringing to existence a finite effect must have chosen it to come to existence. Choice indicates a will, and a will indicates it can have a relationship with personal beings. Do you see?
Where's the evidence? Yeah.
Conceptually, so conceptual.
Oh, conceptual.
Okay,
But,
okay.
but do you see?
Okay,
but do
you know why that's
I
not
think
funny?
everybody here can see what you're
Is
doing.
it doctor or professor?
Everybody here can see what
Professor
you're doing.
Myers, you know why that's funny? Because you're assuming that you must have an empirical paradigm to everything that you say, a verificationism. It's like logical positivism of the 1960s. It doesn't work anymore. I'll give you an example, because empiricism can't even prove logical truths like numbers. Numbers are conceptual. They're necessary truths.
Science is
so we
not
can't
about
laugh
proof.
that there's no physical evidence for numbers. Do you see the point? Do you understand the point here?
I wonder if I can get in a few words
Yeah, sure,
here.
go for it. Sorry.
We'll see how far I get. I think everybody here can see exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, that's fine.
So what I do is mention something and you immediately interrupt and you give me this
No, I just
long...
want to address it. That's what I want to address. I want to address it.
Case proven. Yes.
Go for it.
And that you immediately interrupt and you throw out this long series of philosophical battleground, which is completely irrelevant to your premise. I don't care about this philosophy, okay? Philosophy is a useful tool for generating good questions, but then science is what answers them. Science does not meddle in proofs. So when you keep talking about proofs, you're just going right over my head. I don't care. The proofs don't matter. What matters is, do we have empirical evidence for anything that you're talking about? And we do not. And in fact, we have empirical evidence that defies these interpretations that you're throwing at us.
Can I address that?
Why? Sure.
Thank you. First and foremost, don't you think it's an unhealthy way intellectually to always require empirical evidence to form conclusions about things? Because that would go back to logical positivism. It's very crude. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I would not agree.
Okay, why not?
Because you need the empirical evidence in order to confirm your interpretations of the world. That what we do in science is that you make preliminary hypotheses, which of course are conceptual.
Sure.
But then you rely on the fact that you have to generate empirical evidence about the world around you in order to test them. When you talk constantly about this conceptual stuff, this philosophical stuff, what you're doing is charging off without anything to ground your conclusions.
Okay, because I think there's a hidden assumption there that the only way you should ground conclusions are empirically. And I agree there's a value for empiricism.
No, that's not true.
But I would argue that there's some logical truths, for instance, that are necessary before you even have empiricism. Do you see? This is why when there was the big rationalist debate, the rationalists for the empiricists, mathematics was the battleground, wasn't it? And this is why you have some empiricists are rationalists for mathematics, but when it comes to the world, the empiricists. That's how they reconciled it. There was a philosophical contradiction there. So it's useful having this discussion, but I think there is that, crude view of that empiricism is the only way formed to form conclusions about life.
No. This isn't about absolutes. This is not about. Not that I'm saying that there's only one true way to interpret the world.
Sure.
What this is saying that the one reliable method we have requires confirmation from empiricism.
Okay.
You have not demonstrated another reliable method, because there are lots of people who believe in different religious views. They're all sitting there making exactly the same kinds of arguments you do. The Christians make the very same arguments you do.
Yes, they do, of course.
Yes.
Some Christians, not all.
Most
Some
of them.
just have faith or just
Whatever.
blindly believe.
But the point is that you are both using the same methods and you are arriving at completely different conclusions.
Yeah, I agree. Can I tell
So-
you why I agree with you?
Okay, go ahead.
The reason I agree with you is because, see, we've got one aspect of a philosophical justification for the existence of a creator cause, whatever you call it. Now, from that, then you have the concept of revelation, the concept of a text that is claimed to be from the divine. Now, we would humbly argue that, the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims, we would say is a very intrusive text. It's an imposing text, right? But this imposition, we would argue, is positive because, frankly, I think it just makes you think. For example, the Quran says, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, do not use your brains. يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, for those who reflect, deep reflection. The Arabic word here means to really reflect about the implications of something. But the Quran goes further than this, which is quite weird from a religious book, from a secular perspective. It actually says, if you don't believe from the divine or from the supernatural, then challenge it. So what we would argue humbly is that there are no naturalistic explanations for certain statements in the Quran. For instance, some statements in the Quran that they mention geology and concept of isostasy, for instance. Concepts of that the mountains have like root-like structures, which we just found out recently. If you go to the book Earth by Dr. Frank Press, it concludes that. So how could a desert Arab who knew nothing about science, was so primitive, that, for instance, they used to believe mountains to keep the sky up, would come to such conclusions? We would humbly argue philosophically, we exhaust naturalistic explanations, so it's a signpost to the transcendent. Do you appreciate that?
No. I've read these same interpretations.
Okay.
In particular, the ones I'm really interested in, because I'm a developmental biologist,
Sure.
are Keith Moore's nonsense, total that he talks about.
You disagree with Keith Moore?
Why is that
Oh,
nonsense?
yes.
Why is that nonsense?
I've read those sections of the Quran.
Do you disagree with the stages of embryology? The Quran, the
Yes.
seventh.
Yes,
So
let him say why,
yes.
let him
The
say why.
Quran
Right.
is babbling. It's throwing out these very vague, fuzzy descriptions of the embryo looking like chewed flesh or whatever.
Oh no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about.
That's what I'm talking about.
No, I'm talking about specific stages of embryology. For example, the bones are formed first. That's what Dr. Keith Moore was talking about.
Yes.
7th week, and then
We have
the muscles are formed in the 8th week.
We have a series of very well described, very thoroughly analyzed steps in the development of the embryo. And if you go to any embryology text, they will lay them out for you.
Right.
You cannot substitute the Quran for that. When you look at what the Quran says about it, it is vague, it is ambiguous.
Sure.
It's the kind of stuff that a desert nomad might guess about what's going on.
I mean, I would disagree. I mean, wouldn't be able to guess the formation of the bones in the 7th week
Yes.
straight after. The word is
Yes.
thumma in Arabic, straight after.
Immediately.
And
See,
that's-
when we do scratch the surface rather than have a superficial
But
understanding,
again,
I
this
think we'll get it better, right?
this is again something where the Quran is basically stealing from Greek embryology.
Galen, yeah?
Well, I'm talking specifically about Aristotle, who's
Okay.
made these
Well,
observations.
Aristotle's embryology, if you study it, I mean, I'm sure you've studied it.
Yes.
He believed that fetus is formed by the mixture of menstrual blood and semen.
Correct.
Well, Quran doesn't make any statement like that. And on top of
So?
even if we go further to Galen had
No, but-
many stages of embryology, and the Quran doesn't
My
have any of those
point,
stages.
my
Yeah.
point
Yeah.
is that there's very little about embryology in the Quran.
You-
What there is.
Details are not there. You're right. Yeah,
That's
the
right.
details are not
and
there.
what
yes.
what details are there
Yeah.
are obviously cribbed from Aristotle.
No, not
Yes,
at all.
You can't make
Not
that
at all.
link. The reason you can't make that link is because
Which
you
particular-
would have to assume that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, would have known what was right, taken it, and then threw away what was wrong. I mean, that's a big assumption. You're
it's
claiming
not.
supernatural here.
What I would
You see?
say is that Muhammad was a man of his times, that he was consulting with scholars at the time, that these were ideas that were current
the
and
empirical evidence?
common.
But there's no empirical or historical
Historical
evidence
for that. There isn't.
But it's just an assumption.
But it's
That's
a,
faith.
it's a no.
I have
it's-
faith
it's-
that the Prophet Muhammad borrowed things from scholars.
Yes,
That's faith.
no,
A man of
that's a-
faith, ladies and gentlemen.
That is a reasonable assumption.
No, how could
The,
it
al-
be?
the alternative is to assume
But the
that
history is counter to that. The history is counter to that. You see?
you're saying that Muhammad was some kind of ignoramus living in a cave for all of his life?
No, what I'm
Not
saying
at all.
was, even if your assumption was true, it would still be incorrect because the scholars of science at the time had no idea. They had absolutely no idea what was going on with regards to science. They thought that mountains were keeping the sky up, for instance. Yeah,
And that's not true either.
exactly. But this is why.
No, that's not true. What you're saying about the scholars of the time.
No, well, in Arabia, definitely that was the case.
No,
And-
in fact, there were no scholars in Arabia. In his city, there were only 17 people who could read and write. Forget the sciences and the complicated knowledge of scriptures. There were only 17 people in his entire tribe who could read and write.
I'm just kind of surprised that your argument rests on the fact that you're arguing that Arabs were ignorant nomads who knew nothing at all.
Yes, this is what we're saying. Yes. There were people who were
But so
killing their
was many
daughters.
Europeans at that time as
Yes.
well. I mean, there are lots
But
of people.
I
like that.
think the historical evidence shows that there's much more trade and communication going on than you are giving people credit
Well,
for.
you can be ignorant and do trade. I mean, we have
Yes.
people doing trade today who are ignorant.
And
Look at the bankers today, man. What
and
they've
that-
done to us.
and that
They've
trade-
kept all our money.
and with trade comes information. Like I say, when we look at the descriptions of embryology in the Quran, and we look at the descriptions of embryology in Aristotle,
Sure.
they're the same.
Well, in what way, sir? Would you like to give us?
No, I don't think they're the same.
The discussion of the development of bones, etc., all these things, the fairly crude stages that are described in Aristotle, it's obvious.
You may have a point there. I'm willing to accept that. What I'm saying is, I'm willing to accept that there may be similarities, not that Quran borrowed from Aristotle. My contention is that the specific stages described in the Quran, how does that match with what Aristotle said? I mean, those stages are quite peculiar to the Quran. Quran is quite unique in describing those stages because the
stages-
bones are formed first and then the muscles, and this is how would a desert nomad know
Okay,
that?
right now, I'm laughing at this idea that this is a specific description of embryology. Yes, bones develop first, then muscles.
I agree
come
it's
on.
general.
Yes.
No, I agree
What
with you.
do
It's
you do?
general.
This,
Professor,
this,
it
this is
Professor
something
Myers,
that you can infer just by rational thought about embryology. You can also just determine this by looking at fetuses from different animals. You can look
By
at
desecration.
aborted
Sure.
Yes.
Why don't we get more specific when it talks about geology, right? And how could it fathom? How could anyone illiterate, where the science was counter to that time, right? How can you
This is
see?
nothing counter to say that that mountains have roots is
And they have a function that we
What do you do?
understand that
Again.
is in line with isostasy according to geologists today. That to me is quite phenomenal.
And
But
the
once
universe is
again, you've done it.
expanding, astronomy,
You've
universe is
equated these really crude, primitive guesses that you find in the Quran with the specific details of science.
Okay, let me
You're
tell you why they're
trying
not crude. The reason not crude because the Quranic science, and this would be good for everyone to listen, is that we have the Quran is probably the only religious book that tells you, gives you the tools to interpret it, right? So what the Quran says is you take general principles in the Quran, general values or general statements, and you refer them to specific ones related to the same topic. So in normal literature and linguistics, it's called inter and intertextuality, okay? So when we take general statements, we can make them specific with the Arabic language used in the Quran itself. So it's not crude from that perspective, and we have a scope of interpretation because the classical Arabic dictionaries were preserved, and you have a scope of meaning. So when we have the scope of meaning, we know that these things are quite specific. Significantly, even when the Quran says that the universe is expanding, for example, there's the word here, expanding, which actually means expanding in the past or expanding in the future. There is a scope of interpretation. Do you see?
Yes.
So the interesting thing is, we should maybe.
No, it's not interesting. It's not. You're really boring me. this is the same.
Is that an atheist cop out? Maybe.
No. This is the same story we get from Jewish scholars, from Christian scholars. They do exactly the same thing.
Well, I'm not
Textual
Jewish or Christian. I'm Muslim, and we're
it's-
talking
it's
about a specific
standard-
issue.
It's standard religious analysis.
Yeah, but Professor Myers, wouldn't you think it would be highly arrogant of me if I said to you, what you're saying is typical atheists, what they say, they change the subject, they go to history, and they say that you're the same as the Jews, you're the same as the Christians, and throw all these outdated cliches. Would you appreciate me doing that?
Go ahead.
But I wouldn't. Do you know why? Do you know why I wouldn't do that? Because I really want to engage with you. I really want to engage with you. That's why.
But no, you do not. Of
course I do.
You want to parrot dogma at me and have me accept it.
I'm actually
And-
accepting a lot of your assumptions and premises. I don't have a problem with
Well,
that.
you did also try to assert and project faith onto him.
Yes.
And
Well,
we are
he
not-
said it was an assumption. That's why.
And
you can make an assumption based on evidence. Faith is an assertion based on no evidence.
We've been talking quite evidentially here.
That's
Okay,
what I'm telling you. That for instance, when we look at Aristotle's words, when we look at the descriptions in the Quran, we see a correspondence.
Well,
That is
you haven't shown
evidence.
us any correspondence.
Yeah, that's the point. That's just a
You haven't
statement.
shown us. This is a statement. Aristotle is like the Quran. How? How?
I'm like Einstein, everyone.
Aristotle also describes the emergence of bones and muscle
Right.
in sequence.
Right.
Okay.
And it's like the Quran.
And it's like the Quran, which
Well,
is
does Aristotle say the bones come first and then the flesh and the muscles? Does he say that? Are you sure?
Anybody that works
I'll let you think about this.
well.
Anyone that
If
works
you
with
are you
livestock
are
would
you
be
is
able
that
to
what
figure
I'm not saying
Wait.
it. Can you tell?
is
Are
that
you
what
sure?
is that what the Quran specifically says? Bones
Absolutely.
and-
This is exactly
Then-
what the Quran says.
then
Chapter
we're done
23.
because you just demonstrated the Quran is wrong.
Yeah, but
How?
Professor Myers.
Because
How
that's
is it
not,
wrong?
that's not what happens in the
Well,
book.
this is what the embryologists are telling us.
The
This is
embryo-
exactly
no,
what the
they're not.
embryologists are telling
No,
us.
they're not.
Okay.
Embryologists- if I-
Let me tell you what Keith Moore said. I mean, you can disagree with him.
He doesn't like Keith Moore.
I don't know why you don't. What he said on the page number 364A of his book, The Human Embryo, that in the 7th week the bones are formed, and immediately after that the flesh is formed, and the bones
is
are clothed with
nonsense.
flesh. Well, Keith Moore is wrong. He's an
He's wrong.
embryologist. This is his field.
It's my field too. I know he's wrong.
You're an embryologist.
That yes.
Oh, great! Wow, that's news to me. Okay.
So that's wrong because what happens first is you have differentiation of mesoderm.
Right.
That within the mesoderm you have segregation into things like embryonic mesenchyme, and then you have these cartilaginous centers that will form bone.
Right.
And these are forming simultaneously with each other.
Right. Simultaneously.
Yes.
Even if that's the case, the Quran is right, because thumma is very, even if that's the case, linguistically the Quran is right. Thumma literally can in Arabic language means things happening simultaneously.
in
Yes,
parallel as well.
yes.
But
in
that's
parallel.
besides the point.
I have a question
Wait,
for you.
let
see?
me Professor Myers, I think what's interesting, even if you're right, that means we would have to assume that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him, actually used to go and look into biology. It was a biologist. He would actually go and investigate things about mountains.
He was an astronomer?
He must have had a library of an Alexandrian magnitude. So even when you make these assumptions, it's still problematic.
He was a geologist?
No, because this is what I've been telling you.
Sure.
There are no embryological details of any consequence in the Quran.
Well,
This is not stuff.
the details are not there. You're right. The
This is
details
not
are not
stuff
there.
that requires a huge library to figure out. This requires a passing acquaintance with general knowledge about the primitive state of biology at the time.
That's a fair point. Are you willing to accept now that Muhammad possibly had general knowledge about astronomy, hieroglyphics? He had knowledge of, for example, geology.
Yep.
He's talking about isostasis, something about isostasis. Okay, so he must have been going around studying with some scholars in Arabia. He wasn't a shepherd. He was a very literate man. He was teaching in a university. He was an intellect, and all those people who believed in it at the time, there must have been blind bunch of bigots, and they just followed him just for the sake of it, just to have a drink.
No, I've been saying quite the opposite. I'm saying that he's a man of his times, that he was part of a culture,
Right.
that the Arabs of that time were not quite as primitive and dogmatic and ignorant as you seem
Well,
to claim.
it depends what books you're reading, sir, because
Yeah.
this is my
history.
I'm a historian from the University of London, and I'll refer you to the books of Irfan Shahid, who's an authority in this field, the pre-Islamic Arabia, and he states that Arabs at the time were a primitive society.
Yes.
And now you're saying yes.
Well, no, I agree that they were.
Well, if they were primitive in the sense that they were not.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
There was no Arabic language written down at the time.
On the one hand, you are complaining that there's this detailed, wonderful science
Sure.
in the Quran
Yes.
that he could only have learned from, revelation.
Sure.
And I'm saying that no, that what you find in the Quran is an extremely primitive science. There was nothing more than the common man could have learned from, general interactions with learned society at the time.
Like mountain roots as well. How would they even know that? It was not even knowledge at that time.
Mountain roots. Whoop-de-doo again. It's all it's saying is that you've got this mountain that's going up here, and there's a lot of depth beneath it.
And then they would understand the function of that as well.
Yes.
The function.
It is.
Yes, the function in the Quran
It
is
is, absolutely.
to anchor the crust and things like, and that's not the case. That's again wrong
It's
geology.
not to anchor the crust at all.
What is it for?
It's actually to, from my knowledge, it's actually to, like Archimedes' fulcrum point. Like that's what isostasis come from. It's like another term to discuss the Archimedes' fulcrum point, and that's what it's there for. That was the
That's the
discussion
sad
there.
thing here is you're missing the enormous picture to focus on the pixel.
Yes.
Okay? The enormous picture is that you have something that only communicates with the least credible possible proponent. And he wants you to believe impossible nonsense for no reason. And only if you believe impossible nonsense for no reason will you be saved. And you will get unimaginable rewards if you believe whatever the priests are selling. And you will suffer a fate worse than death if you don't buy into their nonsense.
That's not true. That's quite a sexy way of looking at it, I think.
Sexy way to look
Yeah. I mean, well, you've...
language barrier here.
You're all about the sexy way.
No, you sexed it up slightly, right? Because actually, what I've just discussed with Professor, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Professor Myers. What I discussed with Professor Myers was like actually the Quran is quite opposite to that. It's not a text that says believe just because I say so. It actually tells you to, for example, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. In Arabic, it says, do you not use your mind, your intellect? So it's telling you and trying to evoke thinking. Do you see?
I just want to make sure we don't have a language barrier. So when I said that you are punished for not believing, you're saying that I'm wrong, that in your religion you are not punished simply for not believing.
No, you're right, but it's bigger than that. It's an existential question.
I was right.
No, well,
What else am I wrong about?
well, I think the way we connect with each other is not by having yes or no answers, but having a conversation, right? So it's an existential question. For example, see the.
Hold on just a second. I want you to think for a moment about the creator of the entire universe. Doesn't give a rat's ass whether you do anything good or bad in your life. All that matters, the sole criteria, is that you are gullible enough to follow the story of the least credible illiterate proponent you can follow. That's the sole criteria, and that's all.
No, that's not true.
Okay,
There's two
that's
things.
not it. Then an unbeliever could be saved. An unbeliever would not go to hell. if all unbelievers go to hell, then the sole criteria is gullibility.
Let me give you an example. First and foremost, what we say is that the Quran says we do not punish anyone until they have given the message. And there is another concept in the Quran called Dalil Burhan, which means conclusive evidence that you require as to be conclusive. Now the second thing is, because the message is good for you, that's why. And we've seen that in history. So no, well, maybe no. There's another point.
Let's not get stampeded here. This is just one at a time.
No stampedes. Okay. The other point is an existential question, because we believe in Islam of this philosophical principle called the fitra. Fitra means the innate disposition, and we believe that human beings have been created with the innate disposition to acknowledge oneness. Okay, it's a spiritual concept, the oneness of God. And what we say is, when we deny ourselves, that's why the question who you are is an existential question in the Quran, saying, who are you? Are you just a product of American society? Are you a product of capitalism? Are you a product of communism? Are you a product of the system? Are you a product of your parents? If you are, then who are you? You're just like a social biological robot that someone types in the code and you just act in accordance. And the Quran says, don't do that. Think about your reality. And it says, are you just going to follow your forefathers? And it says, literally, even if they were based on no knowledge. So it's an existential question. And from that we say, if you don't know who you are, then you're just rejecting yourself. And God says in the Quran that to deny God, or to reject God from that innate disposition perspective, is like denying your own self. Okay. So the point I'm trying to say is it is an existential question, and that's why it's useful to always have these kind of good discussions all the time.
No, my primary interest is in phylogenetics. So when I go to deny myself, I would have to deny that I am an evolved ape. That's what I am. That's what we all are. The Quran, so far as I know, in denying evolution, denies itself. And you are telling me that what I have to instead adopt
it doesn't deny all principles.
The Quran doesn't talk about evolution.
Regardless. So, what you're telling me, it talks about Adam and Eve and all of this, and the great flood that we know didn't happen and all of that. But apart from all that, you're asking me to accept this uber-galactic super being.
The Quran doesn't talk about the great flood either.
Okay. Okay, just to clarify, the important point is you're asking me to accept this uber-galactic super being, of which we have no evidence at all, from a system of religion which has so far only produced failure in every predictable sense, and you want me to believe that this thing will punish me simply for not believing, and it wants me to believe the least credible people and the most improbable stories, and I'll be punished if I don't. How is that not a criteria of gullibility?
Well, there's two assumptions here. First and foremost, said there's this galactic being that doesn't exist. I would deny that. I think there's very good reasons to believe that a divine exists, and I could articulate them for you.
You can read this book. You'll discover it's all the way through.
Professor Myers, because we really want to listen to Maryam Namazi, because she has outdated cliches about the Sharia, right? Especially when she talks about rape using four witnesses. That's nowhere in the Sharia. That's not at all. Testimony is enough.
Booklet, I just read a booklet. It's a joke.
We'll listen to that. The thing is, if we pay for your ticket to come down to London, would you have an intellectual dialogue with us with a non-Muslim coordinator?
An intellectual dialogue with you about what?
Well, what would we just doing so far? Would you do that?
I'll be around. You might be able to. Yeah.
I'll give you a forum.
Cool.
Okay. We'll book you on the Magic Sandwich Show.
Yeah. Put you on television.
What's that called? What is that?
Magic Sandwich Show. Yeah. What did you think of that?
Is that a real show?
Yeah, it's a real show.
Can I get a sandwich?
It's a magic sandwich.
Cancer.
Only if it's halal meat, right?
Certainly.
Cool. Anyway, good to see you, Professor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. It was pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is Adnan Rashid. I'm from Islamic Education and Research Academy, London. Your speech was quite passionate. I admire you for that. But you sounded, I mean, this is my humble opinion, I don't know if you agree with this, you sound like an Iranian mullah, very aggressive. I mean, you even used the term during your speech that we need to be more aggressive it doesn't help the atheists to be aggressive to the people of religion, because if anything, the people of religion, they think that atheists are just like those inquisitors in the past, and if they come to power, they will eradicate any kind of religion from the face of this earth. Coming to the point of Sharia law, I mean, you raised some interesting points during your passionate speech. If you study some of the modern academic studies, I mean, I'm a historian myself from the University of London, and I have studied extensively. I mean, I've been studying Sharia law for 10 years almost, and I've studied some of the works by some modern historians and academics about the Sharia law and its fruit. Some of them argue that Sharia law, in fact, was one of the best things which happened to mankind. Let me elaborate. I know it's funny. I know it's very funny. Well, let's see if it's funny when I finish. One of those people is from SOAS, Professor Thomas Arnold. He stated in his book, Preaching of Islam, that Islam saved many of the minor Christian sects and the Jewish religion from extinction, from the Catholic Church or the persecution of the church. Then you talked about the Enlightenment. If you study the history of Enlightenment, a lot of the enlightened works were coming from the Islamic lands, such as Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, and the fruit was directly the fruit of Sharia. It was the Sharia law which enabled the masses to come together in a protected society where the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims could work together in harmony and produce the result which we saw in Enlightenment. So there is a side which you presented, which is kind of very vicious, and there's another side to it which is presented by the academics and historians of the University of London. One such people is Charles Burnett. I don't know if he's an atheist or a Christian, but he's definitely not a Muslim. Charles Burnett, he has written extensively on the influence of Islam on the European intellectual tradition, and he argues also that Islam played a major role in the enlightenment of Europe and civilizing the Europeans. So Sharia law had good fruits as well. So can you talk about this fruit as well, please? Thank you.
You want to communicate atheism to the world, and we want to have a connection with you as a human being.
Science. I want to communicate truth.
Good.
Do you believe in evolution?
Do I believe in evolution?
Yes.
I believe that I don't have adequate information to even make that judgment.
Well, that's very sensible. Now, let me give you some adequate information.
Oh, please do so.
Okay. The evidence for evolution is absolutely solid. It's as strong as the evidence that the planets orbit. You do believe the planets orbit the sun, do you? Yeah.
Yes, I did science as a bachelor's.
Well, you did science, so why don't you know about evolution?
Because it was psychology, that's why.
Well, psychology ought to include evolution because the human mind, the human brain, is an evolved organ. Okay, the evidence for evolution, although it happened a long time in the past, so you can't actually see it happening, or most of the time you can't. Nevertheless, I use the analogy of a detective coming on the scene of a crime after the crime's been committed. So you can't actually see it happen, but what you see is all the evidence, all the clues, all the fingerprints, all the footprints and everything else. And that adds up massively, more strongly than any court of law.
I agree with this,
yeah.
But the only contention some religious philosophers would have, for example, not all religious people don't like science. Many religious people like science. For example, a lot of the scientists were revived from the Islamic history, as you know. The question that they would have is, evolution is a non-complementary paradigm with what's happening in cosmology, for example. For example, if you look at physics and the constants, some people say there'll be a fine-tuning here. There's some form
what do you
of
mean by
design.
non-complementary paradigm?
Because,
what do you mean?
For example, I think you answered that question well in your book, page 157, 158, when you said we don't have an answer for physics like we do as in evolution. So the question you posed was, who designed the designer?
Yeah.
And I think what some Islamic philosophers contemporary would say, That's an interesting question, but even in the philosophy of science, and I think downstairs you wanted to ignore that question about the philosophy of science, the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. And to have an added infinite regress of explanations undermines the very fact that we need an explanation. So the design argument is more plausible than the chance with regards to the fine-tuning of the universe, which has nothing to do with evolution. That's
No, it's
way
nothing to
away.
do with it.
Yeah,
It's a question of physics.
Yeah.
But how can it possibly be helpful to explain the origin of the universe, to postulate something complicated like a god? Why don't you say it's something like a spontaneous quantum fluctuation, something like that, which is simple?
Richard, that's a very good point.
Which is simple.
That's a very good point. But haven't you assumed that God is complicated and made of many parts?
Well, God's got to be complicated, hasn't he? Otherwise, because he couldn't forgive your sins and listen to your prayers.
But you're misconstruing physicality for like an entity with ability. Someone may be able to do complex things. Doesn't make his nature complex, though, surely. Because I think you're superposing.
What are you talking about?
Okay, do you want me to clarify?
If God is capable of listening to prayers, forgiving sins, knowing when you've done wrong and punishing you for it, how could he possibly be anything other than complex?
So are you saying that the design argument is not plausible because it creates more questions than it answers? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, but don't you think then a bloated multiverse or multi-universe is far more complex?
No, I don't actually. A bloated multiverse.
It has no rational force, does it?
A bloated multiverse is actually rather simple. It's just very wasteful. It's very uneconomical.
But doesn't go in line with Occam's razor, though. Do not multiply.
Yes, it does. Right. It does really. No, it does rather.
How does
well,
it do that?
it's not. For a start, it's not beyond necessity. If it actually helps to explain something, it's not very complicated. It's just saying there are lots and lots and lots of universes.
Well, you're saying there's an infinite amount of universes.
Well, I'm not saying that, but
that's the theory.
Some physicists do. I'm not necessarily.
Designed by an intelligent creator, omnipotent creator being. Can you just run me past why, if we're all designed, most religious people, first thing they do is chop off half of the genitalia?
I'm going to go.
Take care, Richard. Thank you very much.